Hello everybody and welcome to my video on the Kyocera T-Proof. This was also called the Yashica T4 Super, the Yashica T4 Super D, which I believe was the date version of the Yashica, and then the Yashica T5. So the T4 Super and the T5 were functionally the same camera. I think maybe just the T5 had a different color, something like that. Anyway, so if you have any of those cameras, what we're about to talk about will apply. This is a 35mm compact camera, often called a point and shoot. It has a 3-point infrared autofocus system that are coming out of, I think it's this one, and this one, these 3 points. And it uses the infrared beams from there to figure out the distance to different parts of the scene and figure out what needs to be in focus. I could not find what type of light meter this camera uses, though, I mean, it meters just fine, but I couldn't tell if it was center weighted or averaging or autofocus linked, anything like that. It has shutter speeds of 1 second to 1/700th of a second, and the flash sync is an unknown shutter speed. I couldn't find what range or what shutter speed or speeds that the flash syncs at. The target market for this camera when it was released would have been, generally speaking, the high-end casual photographer, but there was another market for it as well because this has got a date imprint capability on it, and it was called the T-Proof. I believe that the proof has to do with the date proof that it was printed on here. This would have also been good for doing things like documentation in a professional setting, inspection work, and things like that, where you want to have the date of when you inspected a house's foundation or something like that. This camera, we know it's, by the way, marketed at a fairly high-end consumer because it uses a Zeiss 35mm f3.5 Tessar lens, which is a 4-element lens that uses 3 groups. I actually really did try to find a diagram for it. I'm sure it just looks like any standard Tessar, but I couldn't find an exact diagram for this lens. But yeah, so Tessars are a lens that was a lens design that was pioneered by Paul Rudolph at Zeiss a long time ago. And by the time that this camera came out, they were an established and well explored design. So, and if you've seen my review video on this camera, you'll know that this lens is very capable and good. The aperture range on this lens goes from f3.5 to f15.5. The camera reads the DX codes on your film, which are, I don't have a cassette handy, but if you have a film cassette and it's got like a checkerboard of silver and black right here where this barcode is, that's a DX code. And that DX code is what communicates the film speed to the camera. If, like this film, there's no DX code, this camera will assume that it is a 100 ISO film and expose it at that speed. So any film without a DX code slower than 100 ISO is not going to work on this camera unless you can push it up to 100. Films like this one, which would have been a 400 ISO color negative film out of a disposable camera, you could put this in, it'd be overexposed a couple stops, and that would be just fine. This camera is weather sealed. It has a waist level finder as a very interesting feature. So if you are holding it and you look through this waist level finder, there's a window right here that will allow you to sight up your scene and see what you're going to take a photo of. I have used this. It's an interesting thing, but it's also at the same time kind of a gimmick because it's really hard to see what's going on in here. You're not going to be able to make out any detail whatsoever. This is, if you put your eye right next to it, you can't even focus on it because of the way that the viewfinder is designed. So you have to have it away from you a bit, and it's just a very tiny image. And then the last thing about this camera is that it has a very simple interface. There's lots of stuff on it, but there's not that many different buttons. And so it has a simple interface with only select functional options. This was produced by Yashica in Japan, approximately in 1990. I couldn't find exactly when this was made. It was preceded by the Yashica T4, and it was followed by nothing at all, because the T family, I should say this was preceded by the Yashica T4, and it was followed by nothing in the T family, in that there were no more T point-and-shoot cameras after this iteration of the cameras. I could not find anything online that was conclusive regarding Yashica and Kyocera compact camera lineages, so I couldn't tell you if something came after the T-line that built on this general structure. So we're going to go over everything that is on the camera as we do, and we'll start up here on the top. On the top over here, we have the shutter release, we have the waist level finder window, we have the LCD information screen. Here we have the self-timer button, and if we push that, it will change the mode to self-timer. There we go. And it's actually going to count down and take a photo right now as well. Here we have the flash mode button, and when we talk about flash use with this camera, we'll go through all of the different flash modes. For right now, if you push the flash mode button, it gives you some different options. And then of course we have the make and model. On the front of the camera, we have here at the grip, we have the power button. So off, if you can see the red line, the camera should be powered on. Waist level viewfinder window. I believe that isn't it? I'm not sure if that's also the standard viewfinder window. It is. Oh, that's very clever. The viewfinder window goes to both the waist level finder and the viewfinder on the back of the camera. Here we have the light meter and I believe also autofocus sensors. There's a little light right there that illuminates and flashes when the self-timer is counting down. The flash, the lens, and again the make and the fact that it's got a Carl Zeiss Tessar lens. On the back of the camera, we have the viewfinder window and the two LED information dots. And when we talk about what's in the viewfinder, we'll look at these in depth and talk about what the dots do and what information they give you as you're using the camera. Here we have the date controls, and if you don't have a date back on this, then there's not going to be anything here. If you do, I'm not even going to bother going through these controls, and here's why. The date on this ended at 31 December 2019, so as this video is recorded and released, almost 4 years ago is when this aged out of its date range, so you can't even put an accurate date on your film with it anymore. This is your film type window, so you can load a roll of film in here and see the printing on it to know what kind of film you're using. On the bottom of the camera, here we have your Japan to indicate where it was made, serial number, film rewind button. So if you're halfway through a roll of film, you can push that in really like with the tip of a pencil or a key or something and rewind your film. Tripod socket. On this side of the camera here, we have the back release so that we can get into the camera, and we'll take a look inside the camera in just a moment. Here we have the strap loop, so that if you have the wrist strap that came, or neck strap that came with the camera, you can connect it to that. On this other side, we have the battery chamber here, and in just a minute when we talk about the battery, we'll see what's inside of that and what kind of battery this camera uses. Now we'll open up the camera again and take a look inside and see what there is. Over here we have the film cassette chamber, and when we load film in just a minute, this is where we're going to put the film to load it. This is the shutter area down here, and so you can see the lens shutter and the shutter housing area. Here we have the film take-up spool over here that will take up the spool as it moves through the camera. That little red line there is an index to indicate how far you need to pull the leader out of the camera, out of the film rather, to load it in the camera. We'll see that again in just a minute. Over here we have a little spring that helps keep the film moving onto the take-up spool. We have the film pressure plate right here, which keeps the film flat as it moves through the camera so that the film images will be properly aligned and in focus. And then we have two little slits here that are used by the date imprint system. And then this foam is around the viewfinder window. And then you can see here also a little electronic band that will connect the date system to the camera, so you only need one battery in this camera. The date imprinter does not use its own separate battery. And that's kind of a nice thing, because there are a lot of cameras over the years that had date imprints that used a separate battery. Okay, so this camera can do nothing whatsoever without a battery. It is fully electronic, so the first thing we're going to do is change the battery. To change the battery, you simply have to. This one's a bit tricky, or I'm weak, or both. To open the camera, what you've got to do is just grab something like a key or a little pry, or have actual finger strength, unlike me, and you can open up the camera's battery chamber. And interestingly, by the way, as we've opened up each part of the camera, you can see this weather sealing gasket around it. So here's the battery that it uses, which is a CR123 battery, and you can see the diagram inside the battery chamber that indicates the positive terminal goes down. So when you take out your dead battery, you grab your new one, drop it in with the positive terminal pointing downward, and then you close your battery chamber, click it into place, and you've changed the battery. The next thing we're going to do is load film into the camera, and this is an automatic camera, so it's going to do a lot of the work for us. Now, one thing about this, you'll notice that this pushes down a bit, and that's going to tell us how to load the film. Basically, here's the bottom of the camera. You take your film and you angle it into the cassette chamber like this, slide it into place, pull out a very short leader. You don't need much on this camera at all, and then set it over here. In fact, you need so little leader on this camera that if you could manually advance this, and you'd only need to advance it maybe 1 frame before you got to good film. The camera will automatically advance, and let's see how much it advances. I'm kind of curious about that. If we open it up, you can see here that it has advanced a little bit more than I think would necessarily be required. Actually, that's quite a bit of film that's been moved over to the take-up spool. What we're going to do, because I am very curious about this, we're going to see when I take the film out how much film it took into the camera. Guarantee it's more than is needed. So after you load the film, then you close the back, and we've seen already it will advance the film some amount. So what's going to happen is every time you take a photo with this camera, it's automatically going to advance the film 1 frame. At the end of the roll, it's then going to automatically rewind the film the whole way and put it back into the cassette. If you're out shooting and you realize you're not going to finish your roll of film, but you don't want to keep it in the camera, just hold down the film rewind button. There it goes. The camera has to be on, but then hold down the film rewind button, and it will rewind the film. And don't actually stop it before it finishes. I just wanted to do that so I could grab this while there was still a leader. It is getting very hard to pull this film out of the cassette because I keep using it for videos, so it's gotten fairly worn out. So, to answer our question from earlier, this was roughly how much film I pulled out of it to line it up to be taken up by the camera. Just like that. I think it really only needs to be pulled out about that far, quite honestly, to start taking photos, but it decided to pull it out that far, which is quite a lot. If this camera actually only advanced at a reasonable amount in order to start taking photos, you could get about an extra 3 to 5 frames on each roll of film. So that's a hair frustrating. Okay, next thing we're going to do is talk about the flash modes. And so let's get a better zoom here, and it'll be a little bit easier to see what's going on with the flash modes. So here's our flash mode button, and I'm going to scroll through each of the modes, and you'll be able to see how they change on the screen as I push this button. So we're going to start with the standard flash mode. I'll turn it off. Whenever you turn this camera off, all of the functions on it reset. So when we turn it on, we get to this default flash mode. Anytime you turn this camera on, by default, the flash will be set to on and will fire if the camera thinks it needs to. So for instance, if you were in a museum or something, you would have to, and it was no flash photography, you would have to manually turn off the flash on this every time you take a photo. So, or every time you turn it on, rather. So right here, this lightning bolt means that the flash will trigger if the camera thinks it should. Push this once. And by the way, the camera will remind you that it's automatically going to flash because it says auto right there. Push this once, and now it brings up that eyeball. That eyeball is red eye reduction. And what this means is that if with this mode enhanced, the flash will pulse prior to taking a photo. Just like that. So you might have been able to see that there was a pulse and then the actual pulse with the flash. And what that does, that initial pulse shrinks your subject's pupils so that the light coming from the flash into your subject doesn't cause their eyes to turn red. So that's what that, or reduces it at any rate. So that's what that does. This next mode is flash right here, no auto, meaning that if there is no auto there and you select this mode, the flash will always fire, whether you need it or not. You could be standing out at the beach in full sun with 400 ISO film and this camera is going to fire the flash in this mode. Next mode is no flash right there. You can see that little symbol is the flash symbol with a circle and a bar through it. That indicates that no matter what, this camera is not going to take a flash. You could be using 100 ISO film inside of a cave. It's not going to use a flash, but it will give you a 1 second exposure. Still, that photo still wouldn't turn out, but it'll try. And then this last mode is force infinity. So what this does is forces the camera to have infinity focus. I couldn't find or didn't write down, I'm not sure which, I wrote these scripts about 9 months ago, 10 months ago now, if the flash will fire on this, but what it will do, oh, there it goes in it. After you take a photo, force infinity goes away, but let's go back to it. What this is good for is, let's say that you have a photo of a mountain behind a lake, and in the foreground there's like, I don't know, a tree or a kid on a swing, or I don't know, something that you want to focus on the thing that's in the background. Well, with this camera, whatever's in the foreground, it's more likely going to try to focus on. So if you set it to force infinity, then it will focus on that distant mountain and lake. And in all probability, if you're using any kind of fast enough film, like 100 ISO or faster, it'll give you your smallest or a very small aperture, which will give you a nice deep depth of field anyway. Okay, so that was everything to talk about with the flash mode button. Now what we're going to talk about are the LEDs in the viewfinder. To try and clarify what we're looking at here, this part of the camera, this is the viewfinder window right here, and then here are the two LEDs right here off to the side. I didn't make this an exactly perfect rendition, but this is what you're going to see in the viewfinder area. So the first thing we're going to talk about are these two over here. They don't have RNG on them. These are the indicators of their colors. Red up here, green up here. Great choices for colorblind photographers, aren't they? Anyhow, the red LED will do two different things. It will either be solid or it will be blinking. When it is solid, what that tells you is that with auto flash, red eye flash, or flash infill, the third one that we saw without the auto, that's flash in is the technical name of the mode. That means when this is a lit illuminated solid, the flash is going to fire. When this is blinking, the flash is charging and is not yet ready to fire, but it will shortly. So then you have the green dot down here, and this can do two things. It can either be solid or it can blink. When it's solid, what that's telling you is that the subject of the scene that you're going to take a photo of is in focus. When it's blinking, that means the subject is not in focus. So if this is blinking and won't stop blinking and you're very close to your subject, what that's trying to tell you is you're too close to your subject. That's one of the things it might try and tell you. If it's too dark for it to get autofocus confirmation, this might just keep blinking because it can't get autofocus confirmation. So over here in the viewfinder, what we have are a few different things. We have your autofocus area. So in general, whatever you put in this part of the frame is going to be the thing that your camera focuses on. Okay. Then if you are focused, let's say at infinity, what's around this outside frame here is what's going to be in your scene roughly. So if you were to say, have a scene where you've got, a palm tree or whatever like that, let's pretend that's a palm tree, and then you've got a beach back here with an ocean or whatever, sand dunes. If you're focusing from far away, the top of this palm tree right here is going to be in focus. But let's say that this isn't a palm tree and a beach, that this is something that's close up, and you're half a meter, 1.5 feet away from it, and it's actually like a plant you're growing in your garden and some soil. Okay. When you are less than 0.7 meters from your subject, then you need to use these framing lines right here instead. If you framed your garden plant and soil like this, the top of your garden plant up here would be cut off in your image, and your image would stop right here. So when you're within a meter, call it in the US, call it 3 feet, you want to frame using this part of the image instead of the whole frame. The closest focus that this camera can give you is 0.35 meters. So, and we can call that roughly a foot in the US. And so you cannot focus on anything closer than about a foot. And if you are within 0.7 meters, just remember to use these parallax lines. Honestly, the number of times I used these parallax lines in the year that I used this camera, however long it was, very few. There were only a couple dozen occasions where I was using them and focusing close enough to, and that's because I specifically set about to take sample photos for the review of close-up things. Okay, so we've done basically everything with the camera now, so we're going to go through the very complicated process of taking a photo. You of course want to have a battery in. You want to make sure your camera is on. You want to have your flash setting as you would like it to be. I'm going to turn it to off just to be less annoying for this video. If you want to use a self-timer, you hit your self-timer and run in front of the camera to be in the photo. And then you're going to look through the viewfinder here on the back or on the waist level if you want to, and you'll sight up your scene, and then you'll push this button to take your photo. Just like that. That's how you take a photo. You point it at the thing that you want to photograph and you take your photo. Okay. What about double exposures? What about double exposures? You can't. This camera is double exposure proof. What happens is after you take the photo, it automatically advances the film. And there's no way to override that, so there is no way to take a double exposure with this camera. So I'm going to give you some tips to use this camera. This camera was designed and intended to be used with center framing. If you remember the framing area that I showed you, it had that circle and then the bars around it. If you put your subject in that center part of the frame, you are going to most reliably get your subject in focus when you take a photo with this camera. The autofocus and light meter read off of the subjects in the central circle of the viewfinder. I guess I did in fact find the information about the light meter. It is center weighted or spot to the center autofocus point. Probably should have corrected that in my outline when I wrote it. Anyway, moving on. If you half press the shutter button and hold the shutter button, it will trigger auto exposure lock and autofocus lock. What does that mean? Let's say that you want to get a photo where this is your scene, okay? And what you want to do is you've got your beach back here again, and you've got your palm tree, right? And you've got a friend who's standing very close up here, just like this, and they're in the center of the image. Okay, great. So you point the camera at them, and you then take the photo. Okay, so let's say you get a little bit closer, all right? And you've got I'm going to draw out the frame here to make it a little bit clearer. You've got your frame here. And the photo you want to take is your friend close up, smiling big, just like that, okay? Shoulders, and then whatever scene is in the background, okay? But with this camera, if you do that, your autofocus area is like this, and it's gonna take a photo of, it's gonna focus on whatever's in the background, and your friend here is gonna be out of focus. So if you want to take this photo with the T-Proof, you can. You point the center area at your friend, okay, and then you have to press the shutter, and then you have to press the shutter button, which will lock the exposure information and the settings, and then you recompose, sorry about that, your frame so that it's composed like this without letting go of the shutter button when it's half depressed, and your exposure that's read off of your friend's face, and the focus that is on your friend's face with the composition that looks like this is what you'll achieve. So if there's, as I mentioned when we were talking about film, if there's no DX code on it, the camera will shoot it at 100 ISO, period, and end of story. So specialty films that don't have DX codes on them, it will shoot at 100 ISO. So like RPX 25 is not going to work in this camera. We'll get to a second reason why it's not going to work in a minute. But if you're using one of the Aerochrome 4 repackages that are very popular as of this video's recording. Those are 100 ISO. They work just fine in this camera. The ISO range that this camera gives you is 50 to 3200. So the slowest film you're going to be able to use would be something like an Ilford Pan F50 Plus, and then you can go up to 3200. Currently on the market, the fastest films as of this video's recording are 800. Even Delta 3200 and Kodak T-Max 3200 aren't true 3200 ISO films, but they can be pushed that far. So at any rate, I wouldn't recommend using either of those films in this camera, by the way. I think they're just a little bit too fast. So the ISO range on this is 50 to 3200. If you're going to be shooting outside, then anything from 50 to 200 will work just fine. If you're going to be shooting inside, anything from 200 up to an 800 ISO film will work pretty well as also. So just make sure that your film has that DX code and that you stay within that range. Anything slower than 50, you're not going to be able to use at all. Even if your 25 ISO film had a DX code on it, this camera would treat it probably like a 100 ISO film. And the last tip I have is the camera always powers on auto flash, as I mentioned in the flash. Oh, we don't need to do that one again. Okay. So some things not to do with this camera. It's pretty much going to take care of itself. It is weather sealed, so it's pocketable. You should absolutely carry it around with you. If you have the strap with it, you should definitely inspect the strap to make sure that it's not about to break and drop your camera. Some important things not to do with this are don't leave your battery in it for months on end if you're going to be letting it just sit around, because CR123s don't have a huge tendency to break and burst and leak, but they can. If also on a note about batteries, if you stick with the higher end batteries like you saw in here was a Duracell, you're going to have better results. And Energizer and Panasonics are good batteries as well. If you get the no-name brand batteries that come off of everybody's favorite online mega retailer, then you're going to risk those leaking and blowing up or not lasting very long. You know, if you have a battery blow up inside your camera, you're just going to ruin the camera, and that's going to be a more expensive replacement than buying 10 years, 20 years worth of perfectly good higher end batteries. So the next thing I have is don't leave this in your car, because the heat can damage the plastic, the cold can damage the plastic, can also affect the mechanisms within it and stop it from functioning correctly. Could theoretically be a theft target, though I don't think of point-and-shoot cameras as being huge theft targets, even though they are quite expensive and very in vogue right now as I'm recording this video. And then this is weather sealed, so you can take it into dusty conditions, maybe even light drizzle, but it's not an underwater camera. Don't take it like out whitewater rafting with you or something unless you have it in a protective case. And as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. So be sure to treat your Kyocera T-Proof, Yashica T4 Super, Yashica T4 Super D, Yashica T5 with care and respect. Thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.